Good evening. My name is Selena Joffrey, and I'm the Director of Business and Policy at Asia Society Texas Center. Thank you for joining us for week 7 of our webcast series on COVID-19, which explores various themes and topics impacting our community. This evening's webcast is on a challenging and difficult topic impacting many of us in different ways on how to cope with the stress of COVID-19. The pandemic has had widespread impacts across society, and one of those is on mental health, as people deal with uncertainty about the future, fear and stress over unemployment, anxiety over the disease, and constant news about the pandemic. We're proud to present this topic as part of the COVID series, as May is also Mental Health Awareness Month. And the theme this year is Be Kind to Your Mind. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Lynn Bufka, a licensed psychologist and Senior Director of Practice, Research, and Policy with the American Psychological Association. Our moderator is Saida Hassan, who's a Houston native and previously worked for the Houston Public Media. She now covers mental health for KERA News in Dallas. Following the conversation, we'll be taking some questions from viewers, so please share your questions throughout the discussion via the Facebook and YouTube comment box. Thank you.
Thank you, Selena, for the introduction, and it is my pleasure to sit down with Dr. Bufka for this timely conversation. Stress is an issue that's top of mind for virtually all of us as we adapt to a world that's been transformed by this pandemic. A recent poll from the Kaiser Family Foundation found that more than half of American adults report worry or stress related to the outbreak is harming their mental health and their well-being. Emergency hotlines have reported dramatic increases in call volume, and the demand for online and virtual therapy options is growing. To start us off, Dr. Bufka, I'd like to ask you, what are some of the causes driving these increases in stress and anxiety?
Thank you for having me tonight on this webinar. It's an important topic. Certainly, there's much that can cause us to feel distressed and overwhelmed, particularly right now. One of the biggest questions is the feeling of uncertainty that so many people have. We're uncertain about exactly what this virus is, where it is, how is it going to impact us. There's so much still to be learned about the virus and how it affects human beings, their bodies, why it affects some and not others, and what the impacts will be. And then there's a lot of uncertainty in our day-to-day lives. Many people have been let go from work, have been furloughed, are working, not working right now, searching for work. Others are suddenly in a telework phase, something they may never have done before, and not sure how that's going to play out. And children are home, learning at home, hopefully with parents as their guides and assignments from their schools, not knowing when they're going to go back. And there's a lot of variation across our country in terms of when things will return to whatever it was or closer to what it was before COVID-19 came into our lives. So there's just a lot of unknown. And when things are unknown and uncertain, that raises our anxiety. We like to have some sense of what to expect, how to plan, what kinds of things that we might do. So you've got this huge level of uncertainty in lots of domains. And on top of that, we're all coping with new routines and new ways of having to live our lives. Routines make our life easy. We don't have to think about what time to get up if we have a routine for going to work every day. We don't have to think about what we wear if we sort of rotate through a work wardrobe. But if that has suddenly changed, you're having to figure out new things about when do I get up? How do I make sure I get an adequate amount of sleep? And that takes mental energy to adjust to new ways of being, which then makes it harder to cope with things that feel uncertain. So that sort of sets us up for feeling distressed and overwhelmed right now.
Right. And of course, we've also seen these changes, these major overhauls to our daily lives play out very rapidly. You and I spoke back in February for a story on KERA, and things looked a lot different in February, as you know. We talked about some of the growing anxiety around COVID-19 as the pandemic was beginning to take shape. And I'd like to ask, how has that public perception and fear around COVID-19 changed and evolved as we have seen the virus reach our communities?
You know, in February, there was the possibility, but it didn't seem as if it was terribly probable at that point. So now there's certainly, it's in the communities, it's in every state. But the volume of the penetration and the impact varies tremendously. I personally live in a zip code in my state that's one of the three highest in terms of the number of cases. But there are zip codes in my state that have had very, very few cases. So the experience is very different for people across the country. Although we see news images regularly of hospitals that are overwhelmed, we hear about it, and some people are experiencing that level of intensity of first degree encounter with the virus, whereas others know that there might be some individuals who've had the virus in their locality but don't know anyone, don't know the workers, and it's not playing out in quite the same way. And their sources of concern really are what's happening with work in the economy and in businesses, and how do I get to a restaurant or get food. So it's, we're having very different experiences, but it's far more prevalent in all of our lives.
That's a great distinction. I think, especially in a state as vast as Texas, where many of us in major urban areas like Dallas or Houston have seen a higher concentration of cases, that's not the case in a lot of rural communities. And do you feel having that personal connection or personal impact of the outbreak is really what makes the difference for people in terms of how they're perceiving the pandemic?
That certainly has an influence for some individuals. If they have an experience of somebody they know having had the virus or seeing the impact in their local community, it feels more real because a virus is not something we see. It's not, we see the result of what happens when someone's had the virus. So it becomes a lot harder to experience for yourself that this is happening and to feel comfortable with the kind of response. And we're having significant differences in the kind of responses that governments have in relation to the virus as well. And you see that because there's so much that's unknown about what's the best way to try to slow transmission and ensure that there's an adequate healthcare facilities to be able to respond to it. So that has certainly played out in people's experience with this virus as well.
Right. Now, before we dive deeper into the topic of stress, I'd like to ask if you could help us understand what is the difference between stress and anxiety, and how can people recognize whether they're experiencing one or the other?
That's a great question. Stress and anxiety are related. They're similar ways of of an emotion, but they are different. As a psychologist, I do distinguish them. Uh, The first thing, though, is they are emotions, and our emotions are there for a reason. We need to have our full range of emotions. Stress and anxiety actually have some benefit for us, although too much stress or too much anxiety or not being able to cope with the experience of stress or anxiety is really when it's problematic. So, what's the difference between stress and anxiety? I think of stress as those times when we feel overwhelmed by what's being placed on us, the demands on us. So, right now, we might have new demands of caring for children at home while we're trying to work, or figuring out new routines, or how do we ensure getting adequate food in a safe way. Those may all be stresses that we're dealing with. And we may not feel like we have the resources to do that, whether it's the financial resources or the emotional resources or the knowledge resources to do those things in the way that's necessary. Whereas anxiety is going to be a lot more about how we're concerned about future events or concerned about the outcomes of various things. So, right now, most of us are probably feeling a mixture of stress and anxiety, with anxiety about, will I be able to continue working under this COVID situation? Or how safe am I from experiencing a negative impact from this virus? Or particular worries or anxiety about a loved one or a friend who has the virus and what the health impact is going to be for them. Those are all kinds of anxieties as well. And stress and anxiety sort of alert us to plan, prepare, take care of ourselves. But when we feel overwhelmed by it, then it actually interferes with our ability to do the things we need to do to effectively respond to whatever we're anxious about or what we're feeling stressed about.
It sounds like many of the questions that are the focus of our anxiety or stress are unanswerable. So, what are some healthy ways that our listeners may cope if they find themselves ruminating on these issues and kind of falling into those thought patterns?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that we can do. One of the things that we try to, as a psychologist, I think about anxiety and stress in several domains. I think about what's happening to our bodies physiologically. I think about what's happening to my emotions, and I'm thinking about my thoughts and how I'm mentally approaching. And there's things we can do in each of those domains that can help us. One, in terms of just our bodies, ensuring when we're feeling super agitated and overwhelmed and our physiology is really going on high alert, if we are able to slow down our breathing. And sometimes an exercise as simple as slowly breathing in for four, a count of four, holding it for four, and then breathing out for a count of six helps to slow down that over breathing and that acceleration in our systems. And when our bodies feel more relaxed, that our minds can often follow as well. Because what the goal is for us to be able to look at situations in a more balanced perspective to allow us to more effectively problem solve and decide what it is we need to do and to let go of the things about which we have no control. So I have no control over whether or not coronavirus is in my local community, but I do have control over how I think about it and how much I'm concerned about the impact it could have on my personal life. And I can think through what kinds of steps am I doing to try to avoid exposure and to avoid transmission. And if I've determined I've done what is reasonable, at some point I have to just let it go and say, I've done what I can. I know that's easy for me to say and much harder to do, but trying to shift our thinking in that way and practicing that can help us achieve that down the road.
Mm. One of the most daunting things about this pandemic is its unpredictable nature, particularly that, many of us are living under several weeks of shelter in place orders, and there's no clear target, there's no clear end in sight as to when this will all be behind us. And I wonder, does this put people at a greater risk of facing chronic stress? And what are some of the implications around that?
Well, certainly, if we are feeling stressed for a long period of time, that does put us at risk for longer term problems, for negative health impacts from chronic stress. So, a situation can be stressful and go on for a long time, but we may be able to adapt to it in a way so that we're no longer activated and as physically and mentally stressed by it. So, it may be one of the goals that we try to have for ourselves with any new situation is to adapt to it, not to necessarily accept that this is the way things have to be, but to be able to figure out how to live with what we have while trying to change towards what we want. So that's sort of one of the basic things we're trying to do in life, right? So to the extent that we're able to figure out what sort of mental and physical and financial resources we can pull together to deal with the current stressors, that will reduce our experience of feeling stressed. And that's what we're trying to do, try to reduce that overall experience of feeling stressed, because chronic stress over time has a lot of negative impacts. It can have negative impacts on our bodies, it can have negative impacts on our mind. We know that chronic stress can be related to high blood pressure. It can be related to other cardiovascular problems. It can be related to obesity. There's some indication it's related to cancer. And then, of course, it can be related to a whole series of mental health concerns as well, such as depression and anxiety and panic attacks. So it really is important when you're finding yourself overwhelmed, stressed, unable to sort of bring yourself into a calmer space, to really try to look at what's happening in your life and how can I change my responses, even if I can't change the situation entirely, to have a healthier frame.
Are there specific groups in the population that may be more susceptible to negative mental health outcomes as a result of the pandemic? Perhaps people who are already living with existing mental illness?
Yeah, there's several groups that we're particularly concerned about, and certainly that's one of the groups, right? The people who already have existing mental illness, who, if they're currently in treatment, thank goodness, and hopefully they're able to work with their therapist, their provider, to continue to build the skills to cope with their existing mental illness and to cope with this new situation that they're finding themselves in. For people with mental illness who've had successful therapies before, this is an important time to remember what has worked for you, to bring up those skills again, make it more active and intentional to be engaging in those kinds of behaviors and thinking patterns, because this is a vulnerable time. But we're also really concerned for other groups as well. There are certainly individuals with known health disparities and in existing sort of conditions of that make them more vulnerable to stress and distress. So if you already have other physical health conditions, it can be harder to maintain your mental health as well because those are so interrelated. Also, individuals who don't have a lot of resources, financial resources or social resources, connections to others, that can be a challenge in a time when everybody has elevated distress. And then there's certainly among Asian Americans in particular, there's an experience of discrimination right now around where the virus has come from, how it's being portrayed in the media, and that level of discrimination we know also has negative health impacts. So there are some groups that we're particularly concerned about, but it doesn't mean that everyone's going to have bad outcomes. Human beings are remarkably resilient, and there are things that we can do to improve our overall health and well-being, whether it's the breathing exercises or building up the foundation that keeps us healthy.
Right. And on the side of health outcomes, physical health outcomes, we've seen racial disparities being reported when it comes to rates of infection and death from COVID-19. Do we run similar risk when it comes to mental health inequities, perhaps in terms of access and susceptibility? And is there any way to get ahead of those negative trends and try and combat those in disproportionate mental health outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely. I was in a meeting right before this webinar today talking about some of those exact issues. We really need to have a conversation about how mental health is something we all can have, that it's something we all have the capacity to develop and build. It can be like a muscle in a way, that there are strategies and skills that will help us to have stronger mental health, just like there are ways that we can do things to help us have better physical health. But we have to understand that we often are in environments that are not healthy, through no fault of our own, whether it's experiences of discrimination or lack of resources or food deserts or discriminatory or prejudiced attitudes on the part of healthcare providers towards particular groups. So we can't look at it just as an individual question. We really have to look at overall systems and how systems need to change as well. So that could be things beginning with education in schools and how teachers are interacting with their students, looking at the kind of education that healthcare providers have to recognize disparities and inequities and their role in trying to shift how care is obtained and access to care. So there's lots of places that we really need to be shifting how healthcare is delivered, how it's identified, how people access it. And this pandemic is really uncovering a lot of those gaps.
We've also heard accounts of people that are faring better than expected during the quarantine. Some people may not be feeling this sort of collective stress that so many of us are tapping into. What do you think may account for some of these markedly different reactions that people are having emotionally and on a mental health level?
Yeah, we all have a range of how we respond to things. Uh, as a psychologist, I really would like to have everybody develop their skills towards resiliency. You know, what I want as a parent is to have my child be able to be adaptable and flexible and to face adversity and figure out how to deal with it. And that's kind of what we all need. This pandemic is just sort of forcing all of us to face that head on. But for some people, this is really tapping into certain strengths in a way, or highlighting for individuals perhaps that the things that they were very worried and distressed over prior to the pandemic, they may be looking at the pandemic and thinking, okay, I was really worried about X. I figured out how to deal with it. Now I know how to deal with this as well. I'm now testing out my ability to look at life in a way that perhaps is more helpful for me, a more approach that works better. I often also tease for some people, like my mother, who is an introvert to the core, that she's been preparing for sheltering in place her whole life. I don't think she will finish reading all the books that she has, and she's actually quite comfortable with much less social interaction. So for some people, having an opportunity to look inward can be very healing or very comforting, because there's a lot that they're finding about themselves that they're appreciating, or some people just really like the experience of more quiet and are better able to adjust to those kinds of changes. So there are individuals who do seem to be adapting relatively well, or even um, seeming to enjoy aspects of the social distancing and the quarantines that we're often facing.
Right. Healthcare workers, of course, are dealing with very unique stressors, working long hours with very high stakes, and often risking burnout in a situation such as this crisis. Are there ways that hospitals and healthcare providers can be mindful of this during this crisis and to better care for the health of these essential workers?
Oh, absolutely. And unfortunately, some of what should have happened prior to the pandemic. You know, we can't roll back the clock on this, but I'm going to say these things for anybody who's in a position to enact these in hospitals and other kinds of healthcare settings to do better going forward. One of the things that leadership needs to do is clear, consistent communication. Even if the communication is, we don't know what to expect for the next 2 weeks, but we're paying very close attention to this and we'll do our best to keep you informed. That's important. And if you had something that you said 3 weeks ago and it's no longer accurate, be very clear that things have changed. Here's new information. Think about the kinds of things that your staff need. So in places where people rely on public transit, and perhaps public transit is no longer as frequent as it once was, and that's going to then impact their commutes and make them take even longer periods of time to get to hospital. Can you figure out ways to help people manage their transportation? Can you ensure that they have access to food when they're working their shifts instead of having to figure that out? Sort of make the basic needs available at the work site. Provide a place on site that as a calm, soothing place to go to. I've heard of hospitals that have created rooms specially for that purpose, where they might have very soothing videos or images that people are allowed to go into and be quiet for 5 or 10 minutes, even in the midst of a very busy shift. So setting up those kinds of things as an organization can be really critical. For the healthcare workers themselves, there's so many things that people are concerned about. We need to think about the training of healthcare staff and to help individuals understand that as a nurse, as a physician, you're not going to be perfect and you may need support along the way. And that's part of what we expect you to do so that you can continue to provide good care to others. But that message isn't always there with healthcare workers. So those are things that I would love to see change as a result of the pandemic. But in the moment right now, when someone's in the midst of a very busy shift and alarms are going off and they're feeling overwhelmed, it may be important, even though there's 100 things to do, to take a moment to slow down so that you're not on high alert and you can more clearly focus on things happening around you. And there's some brief strategies you can do with that, whether it's a breathing exercise, whether it's a mental exercise to try to distract yourself in a way and focus on your favorite place that you have ever spent time at, and just visualize that and imagine every detail of it, everything that your senses are experiencing in that. That sometimes distracts yourself from the 100 different worries and demands in your brain enough that you can then focus on which ones are the critical ones. So there's some in the moment things that are really important to do as well. And then when you leave your shift, go home, do what you can to get the kinds of social support that really is very renewing to you. and focus on getting good sleep, good nutrition, and whatever physical activity you're able to do, because those things really help our bodies stay balanced and help our mental well-being.
I wanted to follow up on your recommendation of breathing exercises. That's a strategy I've often heard mental health providers recommend as sort of an instant physiological solution for calming yourself down. Could you explain for us why that's effective?
So when we're very agitated and distressed, our body is going, our physiology is going. If you've ever had the experience of um, starting to cross a street and you suddenly look up and there's a car or a truck there and you have to jump back, you just got activated to respond very quickly. Jumping out of the way of the moving vehicle was the right response, and your physiology could settle down. In a hospital setting, you don't have to jump quickly a lot. Sometimes you do, but you may not need to, but your body is preparing constantly when you're on high alert and your blood's flowing faster, you're breathing a little bit harder. You may have the physiological balance in your body is off. When you slow down your breathing, that can settle your heart rate, settle your breathing, get your oxygen, carbon dioxide balance back in check, really is what it does. And it slows down that fight or flight response that you're experiencing in your body and allows you to then settle into a little bit more of what's the focus I need to have here. So breathing winds up being very helpful. And it's not deep breathing that we're trying to do, but what I like to call complete breathing. So you're breathing in fully and exhaling fully. When we deep breathe, too often we just do a big breath and raise our shoulders and tense up our chests, and that doesn't help. So you want to breathe as completely as you can, which is far more relaxing.
Mhm. We've been talking about healthcare workers, but of course, there are many other frontline workers who are in settings that don't carry the same types of resources as, say, a large hospital. Folks who are working in grocery stores, delivery drivers, restaurant staff are all feeling the weight of this increased risk of exposure as compared with those of us who have the ability to stay home. And what are some steps that those workers could take during this moment of crisis to try and care for their mental well-being? And how can others who benefit from those services support those workers?
I think that latter part is really key right now. Those of us who are doing reasonably well, I think we have a responsibility, really a responsibility at this point in time to look out for those who might be having a harder time. So, yeah, we might not be happy about standing in line to get into our favorite store, to wear a mask, but the person who's working at the cashier, they didn't put that into place, and they're asking you to do that to reduce their exposure to possible transmission of the virus. And so we can take an opportunity as consumers to try to still be friendly, to thank somebody for the work that they're doing, to spend a moment to call them by name and to say hello. That human connection, which we're not getting nearly as much of because of our physical distancing and not seeing people in the same routines that we had, really makes a difference. It's part of it, stimulates good hormones, it makes us feel better to have those kinds of connections. So it's a benefit to the person who's working in the grocery store, and it's a benefit to us as well. So thinking about what our actions are and how we interact with others can make a huge difference. It's really important, although I'm sure individuals working in grocery stores, working in restaurants who are trying to prepare food when there's takeout available, when they receive sort of the short end of the stick from somebody who's maybe not as patient or kind, that's frustrating. But to the extent that you can let it go and to realize that it probably has nothing to do with you and that it has to do with the stresses that they're dealing with as well, that can help make it less personal, at least in those moments. And then to go on from that, it's again the kinds of things that we'd ask anyone to do when they're feeling distressed is when you're able to be out of the situation that feels stressful. And to some extent, we're not out of COVID situation at all, right? But if you're no longer at work, when you're at home, do the things that help you to feel good, that restore you, whether it's things like being creative or reading or spending time talking to your best friend and not talking about COVID at all. Do the things that fill you up So then when you're in the situations that are more demanding, you've got sort of a good resource of experiences that have helped you feel more sustained and will help you through days that are more challenging.
Of course, the pandemic has revealed just how essential these workers are to our infrastructure and to our everyday lives. But many Americans are also grappling with financial anxieties right now, whether folks are finding themselves newly unemployed, fearing for unemployment, or for the potential effects of an economic downturn. Could you talk about financial stress? What does that do to our mental state, especially when so many folks are feeling it across society? Kind of this collective feeling of worry around our financial health.
Right. Finances are hard. We have sources, we have a source of income, or we might not. If we don't have a job right now, not knowing when we're going to be able to find one and what kind of work we're going to have, that fulfills our basic needs. So to struggle without appropriate finances takes a lot more energy and effort than we realize. If we've never been in that situation, suddenly now you're spending time thinking about, do I pay my electric bill? Do I have enough to have groceries for the full month? How am I going to make this work? Are there resources out there that I can access that will ensure that my kid gets fed this month? That's a lot of mental energy, and that's very distressing. And there's not a way to fix that necessarily other than to try to find the support systems that are available to us, and then to also think critically in our lives about things that, do we really need X, Y, or Z? Can we put some things on hold? Can we negotiate with a lender about something, or a bill about something, when we're in between a tough patch? That's going to be important. For people my age and younger, don't look at your retirement accounts right now. It's just not going to help, and there's nothing we can do about it. We know that markets go up and down, and hopefully you'll be paying into retirement account long enough that by the time you're ready to retire, the market will have gone back up. But we can't control it. So looking at it as if there's a possibility we can control it is not going to help us feel better, unless we have some substantial knowledge that might help us to rearrange our finances. But most of us are not in that position. So trying to find the best advice from experts on those kinds of financial things, and then letting go of it, is really going to be important. For those who do have some money, to really think about, what ways can I save for my future? So if this happens to me, I'm going to be prepared for it. And are there ways I can support people in my community or my family who are struggling more than I am right now? And that could be financial support. It could be baking cookies and sharing them with somebody. It could be sending someone a friendly note and letting them know you're thinking of them. Those make a difference as well.
Mhm. I think a recurring theme in a lot of these instances is that whether we're doing it consciously or not, we're directing much of our mental energy into new places and into a lot of new areas of focus and concern. And that might be why some of us are feeling this kind of increased pressure or stress.
Oh, absolutely. And if you think about it, I'm no longer commuting, which is saving me 2 hours a day. So shouldn't I be so much more productive? But there's a lot more thinking I'm having to do, and how I'm going to navigate my life, which takes mental energy, even if it's not physical time in my day. And the individuals who are posting in social media, who appear to be mastering sourdough or developing new skills, don't compare yourself. We all curate how we present ourselves to the public. We're not the people who have mastered sourdough bread. That's wonderful. Be happy they have a new skill, and don't think that life is perfect in all places. And that's important to remember. This is not a time to think we're in a race for productivity. We're in a race for doing what we can, and for determining how we can manage this sustain this, really, is what we're trying to think about. For some people, they may have sort of gotten into a groove now, and they're doing better with managing how things are functioning and how life is going. And that's wonderful. Some people may not have found their groove, or others may have done okay the first couple of weeks, thinking it was going to be a temporary kind of situation. And the realization that this might be going on for a lot longer than they expected has disrupted everything. that's okay too, but continue to strive to find that balance. And how do I adjust to whatever the situation is that I'm going to be experiencing for some period of time?
Absolutely. Well, an important reminder. I'd like to switch over now to some questions from our audience. Pat asks, can you address our use or overuse of social media and strategies for coping with overload?
Yeah, I think that's really important. Um, Social media should be used in a way that should be. I don't want to say it that way. Social media is something that can bring pleasure and joy in our lives. And as long as we're feeling like we're in control of that, that's wonderful. There's lots of great things that we can do with social media that really can be beneficial and rewarding and really in a positive way. But then we can also find that we're spending a lot of time with social media that maybe we never expected to be doing. I realized how much time I was spending on social media at one point. So I actually set up a timer on my cell phone, and it tells me after I spend an hour combined on Facebook and Twitter, and asks me, do I want to continue? And I generally say no, and I get off. But I've also tried really hard in this time when I pay attention to social media to be selective. So I follow individuals who are positive and uplifting as much as I can. When I look at news, I try to make sure that they're from vetted, reliable sources. I'm very careful about the kinds of things that I share and forward. I try not to contribute to individuals feeling less than productive or overwhelmed with anxiety because of the latest facts or figures. I try to think about how I interact with others and that my behavior is reflecting my own values and ethics, but I'm being respectful of differences. And when that's not happening, I try very hard to cut it off and to do differently. I think during this time, especially thinking about being an ambassador of kindness and connection through social media is sort of my frame for how I'm trying to approach social media. But there's some very practical things too. We don't have to get up first thing in the morning and check Twitter or see what the latest post is in our social media feed. And we can also cut it off at a certain point prior to bed. Let's protect our opening into the day and our settling down at night times and decide the pattern that works for you and then use the parts of it that are good and be okay to walk away from it.
Another question from Sonia, which I think a lot of people can relate to. Can you address the feeling of guilt when I think about other people's situation versus my own?
Yeah, guilt's a tricky one. Can we do something about other people's situations? Perhaps. And if it's within our means to do that, we can make decisions to do that. But most of us didn't ask for the situations that we're in. We tried to make the best decision we could at any point in our lives with limited information. We made the best decisions we could about what kind of jobs to go for, what person we wanted to spend our life with if we have a partner. We made decisions about whether to have kids or not. And we made those decisions at the time with whatever information we had. Then random things happen to us. And sometimes random things happen that we have no decision over, no control over, and we have to deal with that. So that whether or not we're directly impacted or not has nothing to do with sort of our goodness and the choices that we make. Sometimes that's how life has unfolded. So accepting that life can be kind of random at times. And if we do have good fortune, and can we share that good fortune with others, whether it's emotional good fortune, financial good fortune, and recognize that others are trying to do their best and try not to sort of judge others for where they're at, but recognize that they really did the best that they could with where they were at as well. For some of us, right now, doing our best might mean to be a little more still, perhaps to pray. For many people, they find that very helpful. And to try to lift up sort of their neighbors in whatever way they can, and think about how can we contribute to the overall community well-being.
Right. A question from Jen, which is very timely and practical. Could you address tips and strategies for parents experiencing stress with balancing homeschooling and working?
Well, the first thing I'm going to say on that is don't worry about screen time. So your kids are going to be, screen time has a lot. Prior to all of this, we tried to pay attention to how much time our kids were on screens or not on screens. Well, right now, kids are on screens for school, kids are on screens for seeing their friends, kids are on screens for seeing their grandparents. Don't worry about overall screen time. And there may be times when you'll be using screens to just give yourself a break. Focus on instead with your kids, how can I be connected to them? Am I providing them a stable place where they feel safe, know that they're loved, that I'm doing my best to meet their needs? You're not going to be perfect. Nobody ever is. I tell my child all the time when he was little, I would just say, well, you just got a mean, mean mom. And he would be very upset with me whenever I'd say that to him. But he would then start kind of realizing, okay, maybe mom's doing okay here. And if you're feeling completely overwhelmed and stressed out, give yourself a break. I hope there's another adult in the house. And if not, is there a way you can still safely get away from the children to give yourself time to calm down? Because I would imagine it's very hard to feel like you never have a break from your responsibilities. So if there's a way to share that, that's really helpful. If you're working and teaching and trying to manage education with your kids all under one roof, if you have a supportive employer that you can talk with that person about how can I balance this right now, I would really encourage managers to have really honest conversations with their staff about what's reasonable and what can be done and how to best manage time. So maybe you don't work 9 to 5, maybe you work 6 in the morning till 10, then you take a break because you're doing other kinds of things and you come back to work later. Trying to be as flexible as possible with yourself and with your demands, and try to not have super high expectations. You're trying to do the best you can right now and recognize that in the end, what you're hoping for is to develop kids who know that they're loved, who've watched mom or dad figure out how to face a challenge and have come out okay, and that they develop those skills to face that in the future themselves.
Right. And we've been talking largely about the effects of stress on adults, but are children also susceptible to the stress that their parents or other family members may be feeling? And how does that look in children?
Children definitely can be stressed. We often are surprised about the things that they report to us as being stressed. So, a couple of points to keep in mind. Think about the developmental age of your child. Are they very young? What do they know about how tuned into the outside world are they? Little kids, the entire world is the parents. They may actually find this is pretty cool because mom and dad are around all the time and this is what they've really wanted. And they may not understand what's going on. And you decide how much information is appropriate for younger kids or not. With older kids, it's often nice to sort of say, well, what do you think is going on? Tell me what you've heard. You may need to correct some misinformation. Some of the stress that they may be experiencing is not understanding things well, and you may need to try to help provide a more accurate assessment of what's happening. And kids definitely pick up on when we're stressed, but oftentimes they don't know why we're stressed. They know that something's off with mom or something's off with dad, and they often interpret as they're the problem. So be really clear with your kids that you might be stressed because you're trying to figure out how to telework and you're struggling with technology. Please be patient with me while I'm figuring this out, okay, child? As opposed to saying, having them thinking that they're the cause of your stress. So that's an important conversation to have with your child, no matter their age.
Right. I that reminds me of another story that I did where a researcher looked at the tendency of parents to try and hide those negative feelings and how sometimes it had an adverse effect because
Mhm.
children may internalize and perceive that they're the cause of their parents' stress or mental distress. So thank you for walking us through that. Switching gears a bit, Pat asked a question that I was hoping someone would ask, which is, can you share your thoughts on people having ultra vivid dreams during the pandemic?
Oh, that's interesting. Some people really remember their dreams, some people don't. And that what our dreams, the purpose of our dreams is sometimes disputed, but dreams often are the way that we're processing our day. Sometimes they make sense And the pieces in our dreams seem similar to what we experienced in our day-to-day life. Sometimes the pieces in our dreams don't make sense at all to us, but might be linked to things that we're feeling stressed about or whatever. Some people really enjoy the experience of having very vivid dreams. I don't really know that there's somebody who's a dream expert may know this. I don't really know if there's a way to try to change your experience with dreams. I know that some people find it very helpful to write out their dreams afterwards. Other people get very sort of disturbed by having very vivid dreams. It's not necessary to attach a lot of meaning to them if they're disturbing to you. People tend to have, when they're feeling stressed, have things like dreaming they overslept a meeting, which happened to somebody I work with today, or dreaming, have not been in school for over 25 years. I still dream about the class that I overslept or the exam that I forgot about. And that usually tells me I've got something on my mind, but clearly it's not related to a class at this point. So it can be a time to sort of slow down and think, is there something I'm missing? Have I not tuned into something? Is there something I need to address? And that may sort of make sense of the dreams a little bit more.
Right. Along those lines, I've also seen a lot of folks sharing stories about just general changes in their sleep patterns during the quarantine, whether they are feeling much more tired than usual or just having a tough time falling asleep at night. And is there a potential correlation between the fact that we are spending so much more time indoors or, separated from our typical routines and these changes in our sleep patterns?
For sure. I mean, one of the things that helps us sleep is having regular activity. If we're spending a lot of time indoors, we may not be having the regular activity that we used to have. That can have an impact on our sleep. Another challenge many people have is, can they really separate their sleeping space from their awake time? Some people may not live in a place where they can have a separate office. They may have to work in their bedroom. The absolute number one thing I plead with people to do is do not work from your bed, because what that teaches you is your bed is for things other than sleep. So your body doesn't have the cue then that when I get in bed, it's only for sleep or for intimacy. It has the cue of, oh, I do other things in bed. So you really want to separate the bed from things other than intimacy and sleep. That's number one. You may have to work in your bedroom, but try to have a different space for that to the extent that's possible. Think about what helped you to sleep well prior to quarantine. Are there ways you can replicate that? I've learned over the years that reading right before bed, actually, I can read, say, the science section or the food section in the newspaper, and that's okay for me, but I don't want to read the front page of the newspaper. I don't want to read a novel that I really enjoy because I won't put it down and I'll keep reading and reading. But I've learned number puzzles are a great way for me to unwind. And it's become to the point where I pick up the number puzzle, I start working on it, and that's told my brain, oh, it's bedtime. I only do the number puzzles at night. My brain is already shifting towards a sleep mode. So figure out a pattern that helps to wind down your brain at night, that's consistent, that you can repeat, and that keeps to a fairly consistent time for going to bed and getting up. Those will help with promoting good sleep.
Mhm. Slightly more general question. Sonia asks, what kind of strategies can we use or practice for stronger mental health? I know a lot of folks are focused on perhaps tuning in on their physical health during the quarantine. Are there any sort of practices or strategies that may be helpful for strengthening your mental health?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can all think about how do we have stronger mental well-being. And certainly the things we do for our physical health, whether it's sleep, nutrition, activity, that's all good for us too. Social connection is really good for our mental well-being as well. One of the things that we want to try to do is, how can we be flexible? So sometimes that can even be practicing looking at a problem, thinking up a potential solution, and then trying to come up with another one. We don't always do that, but if we can begin to generate different kinds of options to problems, we start being more flexible in our thinking. Can we do things in different ways? That helps us to problem solve. Sometimes we get into thinking patterns where we tend to uh, shift towards the negative with every problem or dilemma faced towards us. Can we think about it in a different perspective and see if there's another assessment of it that's perhaps a little more realistic or helpful to us in how we think about that? Can we do things to try to think about how we prioritize what's important to us. Can we connect our values, what we deem is really most critical to us, and do our activities and our choices reflect that? That will help our overall well-being as well. To have some purpose and to feel like our life is oriented around that supports our overall psychological well-being.
This quarantine has, of course, given us all a great deal of time for reflection. And I've spoken to some people who are opening up to the idea of seeking therapy or mental health care for the very first time. Of course, they may be doing it virtually as we are still adjusting to this crisis. But do you have any advice you would share with people who are brand new to the idea of therapy and seeking mental health care?
Sure. I think one of the things that's important to know is that the data, and I'm a scientist, the data tells us that mental health care provided via video or phone could be just as effective as in person. So don't let that deter you. It may feel different, but it can be just as helpful and useful. I do think it's important when possible to find somebody who's in your local area, even if you're going to see them virtually, because if you need more specialized services or more intensive care, they're going to know the local resources. But don't let that be the only determination. You want to find somebody who understands the kinds of problems that you're seeking help for and has some expertise in that area. So, just like you wouldn't go into a shoe store and buy the first pair of shoes you saw, you don't have to necessarily accept whatever therapist you find. You can ask some questions. What's your background? What kind of problems do you usually work with? Have you ever worked with somebody who's really facing this problem that I have? What do you think is going to happen? So if you're able to ask some questions like that, I realize that's not always possible. Sometimes our finances, our physical location, our health insurance dictate who's available to us. Sometimes the availability of providers dictates who's available to us. But I would encourage you, no matter what, to ask some questions because you're entering therapy for yourself, not the therapist. So you want to make sure it's going to be the right fit for you. But expect that there's going to be some work involved. You're going to be asked to face things that maybe are a little difficult, but you're going to be doing it in coordination with somebody who has particular expertise about mental health and who wants to help you find the solutions that you need to help you get to a healthier place. So while it could be challenging, the rewards could be very beneficial. So I really encourage people who feel that they're particularly distressed or overwhelmed or that therapy really is the right option for them to look into that as a possibility.
Well, we're getting close to our time for the evening, but I want to take one more question from an audience member. Aaron asks, do you have recommendations for people who want to better support vulnerable people in our communities?
There's a lot of things that I think we could all be doing to support vulnerable people in our communities. Those of us who have finances can contribute to local organizations. Those of us who have time may be able to contribute in other ways, whether it's writing to older adults who are in nursing homes and can't have visitors right now and may feel somewhat isolated, or writing to people who are front lines. Or my nephew is a officer in the Army, and the enlisted men and women are feeling very constrained in terms of where they're able to go from their barracks and things like that. Are there ways to connect with people who aren't having access to the kinds of connections that would really be beneficial? Are there things that we can do to think about what would strengthen our community for the future? If you've got little people in your life and you're good with the technology, can you set aside some time to read to them over Skype or Zoom or whatever you use so that their parents can get a break for a little while? So have a nice time that you might be having with children in your life. And if you're not sure what would be most helpful or useful, are there things that you really would prioritize in your own life that you think have a potential down the road that would help to make your community just a little bit nicer? There's a lot of creative opportunities out there.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Bufka, it's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you, and thank you for sharing your insights. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Please tune in again next Thursday at 7:30 p.m. Central Time for the Asia Society's weekly COVID-19 webcast. The topic next week is reopening Houston amid COVID-19, evaluating next steps. Panelists will discuss plans for reopening the economy and how to do so while safeguarding public health. You can find more information about the upcoming webcast through the Asia Society website. Thank you all for being with us tonight, and stay safe.